The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and this is the second edition of Comfortably Zoned in a vat of pine tar. And Alan Blumkin said it best. It pushes my book a little, but I've got four of the most instrumental people in having a book, in my having a book. Hal Bock is here. It featured heavily in my book that was published on the 11th, and I'm really excited about that. Alan Blumkin, you're here.
Hello, everybody.
How you doing, Alan? You were instrumental too in the book because it's based on the podcast that we had, and no more great podcasting with you guys to complete the foursome. David Hubler, you were such a help in editing the book. And wanted to thank you not only for that, but for being a participant in the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to read, and I'm sure everyone who picks it up will have the same pleasurable experience that I did.
Well, that's nice of you to say. And we won't talk about the book much. We're going to talk about football this week, the four of us. And actually, it's the five of us. I thought it might be nice to, because we've done many, many more baseball podcasts over the years than we have anything else. And we all have a love of early NFL football, pre-expansion, pre-AFL. If I said that to you, early football, pre-expansion, what's the first thing that comes to your mind, Hal Bock?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the game that really put football over the top, and that was the overtime game, the 1958 championship game at Yankee Stadium between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants. And it was the first game that went to overtime, and it was televised, and people fell in love with football based on that game. And in fact, that game was played in 1958. Within 2 years, 8 entrepreneurs had put together a rival league, the American Football League. Now, they didn't get into it to lose money. They get into it to make money. And they figured that football was the next big thing. And it turned out that they were right. Football was the next big thing. And ultimately, it took over as America's number one sport. It's not my number one sport, but America has embraced football as the national pastime. It's gotten right past baseball in that respect. But I look back to that game, the 1958 championship game between the Giants and Colts, turning point.
Good. What comes to mind for you, Al Blumkin?
Okay, as I did with baseball, I started following football through the cards. Yeah, there was some very nice, nicely designed sets back then. And how the home games were always blacked out. Now, I was living in Queens at that point. I had to listen to the Giants beat the Browns with the Pat Summerall field goal. The Giants beat the Browns 10-0 in the playoff game and the Colt game on radio because it wasn't televised here.
That's correct. I listened to it on radio as well.
Yeah,
but it was televised. There were some places that saw it.
That's right. I saw it. Living in the North Bronx, it was easy to get up into Connecticut just past the line, and you could pull in the Giant games, not just that game, but all of those games that were blacked out
through some Connecticut channel. In fact, I love this story because it's so typical of how football sort of grew and grew and grew. If you went up the Merritt Parkway into Connecticut on Sundays, you might see a couple of signs that say "football here, football." You could pull into a motel on the Merritt Parkway or one of the other roads up into Connecticut, and you'd be just beyond the limit of the New York TV audience. And these motels would show the Giants football games. And we did that several times, especially when it was an important game like the Giants and the Browns. And the motel owners were thrilled because they got extra revenue because we'd clear out after the game, and they'd come in, and clean up a bit and resell the room for the night. And I remember even some of the motels advertised halftime entertainment. You could go out. They would put up a old tire, and you could try to throw a football through the tire. A couple of them even had the local high school cheerleaders come in and parade around in the parking lot. And it was sort of a Sunday ritual, especially when the games were between the Giants and the Cleveland Browns, their arch rival at that time.
Oh, yeah. Jimmy Brown against Sam Huff, for instance, was as spectacular a matchup as in sports. It made the front page of Sports Illustrated. It was a great rivalry. You're correct.
Yeah. You know what was going on during the time of 1958? There was a newspaper strike here. And I was 15 years old at the time. I walked to Nassau County, which wasn't a big deal for me back then. It was about 25 bucks. And I went to a shopping center looking for Newsday. And when I got there, they told me Newsday didn't publish on Sunday.
Oh, wow. Good memory. Unbelievable memory.
Yeah, the papers were on strike. The newspapers were on strike for a few weeks during that period.
I want to get to George Case. Haven't heard your voice, Georgie boy.
I'm enjoying listening to you guys because Hal brought up the '58 game, and I remember that. I graduated from high school in '58, and I remember watching that game. And I would think that was the first time I really got interested in pro football. I've always, and still today, I'm more into college football than pro football. But I certainly remember, that Giants Colts game, and then you talked about Alan and David, talked about Jimmy Brown and Sam Huff and all that kind of stuff. I mean, those were huge rivalries. And Jimmy Brown, I can still see him. He'd run and looked like he was about ready to die, and he'd pop up, and the next day he'd run through next game, next down, he'd run through the whole team. I mean, he was an incredible athlete. And Sam Huff, he was ready to knock anybody's head off that came anywhere near him. And they were just great memories of pro football back in the early days, that's for sure.
We can't talk about those days without talking about Vince Lombardi and the Green Bay Packers, because you mentioned Sam Huff, and I remember thinking that Ray Nitschke was a far superior middle linebacker. I'll ask you guys if you remember him as being that great, or it's just my imagination.
I will tell you this. Ray Nitschke was a hell of a player. He's in the Hall of Fame, so you know that he was a great player. He didn't play in New York, though. Sam Huff played in New York, and New York was where the television networks had their headquarters. And New York, and one of the New York networks, CBS, came up with the idea of doing a special on Sam Huff, and it was called The Violent World of Sam Huff.
Correct.
And that went a great deal towards selling professional football to the masses here, and it just it caught on. But Ray Nitschke was every bit as great a linebacker as Sam Huff. So, these were great players. Dick Butkus of the Chicago Bears may have been the best one of that group. But they were all terrific football players. There were no marginal players. They were great players. And they built the game. They really did. I know that pioneers of professional football are given a great deal of credit for building the game. But in my mind, the game was on a treadmill until we got to 1958 and that giant Colts game. And then, and with the television networks discovering football and making it an every Sunday ritual, and David's point about the hotels or motels up in Connecticut, there were traffic jams going up there. Because people wanted to see the game, and you couldn't see it in New York. It was, as Alan pointed out, the games were blacked out locally. So you went to Connecticut and you saw the game on TV up there. And slowly but surely, football overtook baseball to become the national pastime. It's unfortunate as far as I'm concerned, because baseball will always be number one in my heart. But football knew how to attract fans and attract the public and attract the networks and attract the advertisers and everything else. And now football is a many billion-dollar business and flourishing. And
Hal, who are the executives that caused that? Because that kind of stuff just doesn't happen. Who had the foresight to market it that way?
Pete Rozelle.
Pete Rozelle.
Yeah.
The commissioner of the NFL was a man named Bert Bell.
Yeah.
And he was a nice fellow, but he was not an innovator. He was not a forward thinker. Pete Rozelle was the commissioner when the merger took place in 1966, I guess it was. And Pete was a marketing guy. Pete knew how to market. And he invented the Super Bowl. The first year was because the AFL was always saying, well, we're as good as those guys. The AFL players would say, we're as good as those guys. And there were bidding wars, as you know, for great players, good players. Joe Namath, for example, had his choice. He could have gone to the St. Louis, I think it was the St. Louis Cardinals had his rights in the AFL.
Yeah.
And the AFC. And he chose the New York Jets in the AFC, I'm sorry. And it was like that throughout football. And Rozelle negotiated a settlement with the AFL because the bidding wars were going to kill these leagues. I mean, it was not healthy financially for these teams. So they came to a merger, and part of the merger agreement was we're going to play a championship game, the AFC against the NFC. And that was the first Super Bowl. It wasn't called the Super Bowl in the beginning because they hadn't come up with that. They hadn't been smart enough to come up with that name until like the third game or so.
And two out of the three major networks, CBS and ABC and NBC, carried the games. That game.
That's right.
Competing with each other as networks kind of merged. That was just a necessity of the day. They would have, as you guys say, in the bidding wars, destroyed themselves.
The other thing
what happened there was they were bidding against each other for college players, and then the Giants, who were in desperate need of a kicker, signed Pete Gogolak away from Buffalo, and that opened up the rush because Al Davis, who was commissioner of the AFL at that point, started signing every NFL veteran who could walk. And superstars were signing, and they had to agree to this. Now, I started watching AFL games because I was in college in Pittsburgh, and the Steelers were always blacked out at home. I started watching AFL because there's nothing else. Another thing that I want to bring up, although I dislike it very much, It's the invention of the point spread. Because
gamblers for it as an opportunity. I mean, they're always looking for a market, you know. But I wanted to point out that Roselle invented the Super Bowl, or what developed into the Super Bowl. And the first game was played in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum in L.A., and it was between the Green Bay Packers of the National Football Conference, or Football League, whatever you want to call it, and the American Football League team was the Kansas City Chiefs.
Right.
And Green Bay blew them out. There was great animosity between the players because the players wanted to prove that they were better. Well, we're a better league, you're a better league, so forth and so on. And the Green Bay Packers dominated. But what was more important to the league was that the stadium was not sold out for the opening Super Bowl, first Super Bowl. And Roselle was furious that they had not sold out that game. And he, on the plane coming back from California to New York, said to his executives, we will never have another Super Bowl or NFC championship game that does not sell out. And he was right. The next year, they sold out the game, and they've sold out every game ever since. And the tickets are enormously priced. You'd have to mortgage your house to be able to buy a couple of tickets. But that's where it started. That's where it started with Pete Roselle. He was a marvelous market guy, and he knew how to sell a product. He came up with the idea of having Monday Night Football. Nobody thought, what Monday Night Football? You play football on Sunday. Sunday was a professional football game. But he sat down with Roone Arledge of ABC. Both of them are gone now, but Roone was the head of ABC Sports at the time, and Pete was the head of the NFL. And they sat down at 21, the restaurant, which was also gone at this point, and they negotiated, and they came up with a package of Monday Night Football games. And suddenly, that became must-watch TV. And all the players who had played on Sunday would watch the Monday night game. And so did the rest of America. And that's how the game was built. I mean, it was a brilliant marketing move on Pete's part, and ABC benefited from it. And we go from there, you know.
And they had a great set of announcers that really helped push the game on the Monday Night Football.
Dandy Don, Frank Gifford, and Howard Cosell.
Oh, God.
Right.
Exactly.
No, you know what? I'm really interested what you guys are talking about that, because Monday Night Football became an institution. I don't think it is today, but you know those three guys in the booth, I think, really made that whole thing, along with what you're talking about with Roone Arledge and Roselle, doing the marketing. But those three guys in the booth, it seemed like America, every Monday night they were all tuned into Monday Night Football.
Right.
But now, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, which counts for nothing, they've oversold, and now they've added a Thursday night package. So now you have football, pro football on Sunday, Monday, Thursday. It's too much. It's overkill, in my opinion. And I think it's damaged them.
And they've added an extra game this year, too.
17 games, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And
the original was 14.
Yeah, back in the 1950s, the schedule was 12 games.
Yes, that's right.
Until they brought in Dallas and Minnesota in the NFL, and that made it 14. Mm-hmm. And the championship game, the only time you had anything other than a championship game, where there was a tie in the regular season. They had a playoff game for that, the division, and that was it. You don't have 17 games. Last year they had games on Tuesday and Wednesday because of the pandemic. It's right. So it's much too much.
Yeah. What haven't you talked about? What isn't talked about in those days that happened? What was it? If there's any one thing, I'm having a hard time wording this question, but what should we know about the 50s that we don't?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I mean, growing up near Yankee Stadium, the high schools in the Bronx, at least, they had an organization called the General Organization, the GO. That was citywide, and that's where you got little discounts on things locally. And we could get for 50 cents. We could get tickets to the Giants football games on Sunday, sitting in the bleachers at the old Yankee Stadium. Now, if you sat close enough to the old Yankee bullpen, which was on the right field side of the stadium, if you sat right against that, you were on the 40-yard line. So for 50 cents, you got to see the Giants play from the 40-yard line. You can't do that anymore.
That's a big secret. Any secrets that you used in fandom in those days, Al Blumkin?
Well, the biggest thing, one of the things I've taken away from that is in the 50s, the Detroit Lions were good.
Right.
You can remember that with Bobby Lane.
Lane, right.
Yeah, that goes all the way back because the Lions won the championship in 1957, and they haven't been close to getting back since then. And
they played on Thanksgiving Day, and a kid learned to pronounce Nick Pietrasante at a real early age. And if you could pronounce Pietrasante, shouldn't you be able to wash up and do the dishes and help out? Yes, Thanksgiving Day, the Detroit Lions. Later came Milt Plum. What did you guys think of him as a quarterback?
Much easier to pronounce.
Right, okay.
And not very much.
And not very much. Kind of mediocre. But
in those days they all played in baseball stadiums except for the Eagles. And San Francisco played in Kezar, and the Eagles played in Franklin Field, but the rest of them were playing in baseball stadiums.
Yeah, Alan, you mentioned, I wanted to jump in here just for a second because all the great players you were talking about, and you get into Philadelphia, where I'm in that area, one of the greatest of all time, and he played at Franklin Field, he played at the University of Pennsylvania, was Chuck Bednarik.
Bednarik, absolutely. And let me tell you guys something. Chuck Bednarik, during the summers, would visit twice a year and have clinics visit my summer camp. And we'd get to hang with him, and it was unbelievable as a kid. I was a New York Giant fan, and it was the year that I remember was 1960 when the Eagles won it, and Van Brocklin took them to it, and he'd have stories of that wasn't the Super Bowl, it's a championship, that I tingled when I realized that I had a close association with him. The last of the two great two-way players.
Right.
That's how
he was. He had a nickname. He was, and he had a nickname called Concrete Charlie. I mean, he was a huge, strong, built like a brick. I mean, he was tough, and I think it wasn't it? I mean, my memory's starting to fade when it comes to that, but I think it was Bednarik who put Frank Gifford out of
business.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That was in 1960.
On a clean hit.
He really hit him, right? Mm-hmm.
Right.
Bednarik was a great... Let me tell you, I interviewed Bednarik once, and he was a great World War II hero before he came to pro football. He fought in World War II, so this was no lightweight. He was an important guy and a stand-up guy. And you're right, that was a clean hit on Gifford, and of course Gifford a year out of his career. But Gifford did come back and play again, and I think Bednarik was kind of felt good about the idea that he finally was able to come back because you don't want to put a guy out and end his career.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to point out about the 50s, I was a Giants fan. As you guys know, I was a New York Giants fan in the baseball world, and here comes a football team called the New York Giants. Well, I'm going to root for them too. The New York Giants in those days had a coach named Jim Lee Howell, and his offensive coordinator and defensive coordinators were Tom Landry and Vince Lombardi, two Hall of Fame coaches who coached championship teams in Dallas and Green Bay. So that's the coaching staff. That's a pretty good trio, I'll tell you.
Pretty good trio indeed. It was a prideful thing to be a New York Giants fan. I remember a game, speaking of that, when the Dallas Cowboys played their first game in Yankee Stadium, and I'm trying to think of the quarterback from Stockton,
Eddie
New York.
LeBaron?
Eddie LeBaron and Dandy Don would alternate at quarterback, and I got to see them play their first game in Yankee Stadium, and that was freaking cool. I mean, football memories are, the wintertime, no baseball, just school. You had to learn to love winter sports, basketball, hockey, football.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Football became so popular that everybody wanted a piece of the action. And some promoters here in New York came up with the idea of having something called the Gotham Bowl. And the Gotham Bowl would be played in the Polo Grounds. And one year, it was a colossal failure because college football here in New York was a zero. They had Columbia, and that was about it, and Columbia wasn't very good. It never has been very good. But the Gotham Bowl was played in the Polo Grounds, and they invited two teams to come in and play. One of the teams was Utah State, and the kicker on the Utah State team was a guy named Jim Turner. Jim Turner became the kicker for the New York Jets, and a darn good one. Now, I was doing a story for the AP about the Gotham Bowl later on in years, and I called Jim Turner, and he laughed, and he gave me one of the great quotes I've ever had. He said, there were more pigeons than people in the stands that day. And I thought, whoa, wonderful line that is. So that's my memory of the Gotham Bowl and Jim Turner.
Well, when you called to me, it was in Crockett, California, about 15 miles from Alameda, and he made his home in Northern California after playing, and not to be confused with Bate Turner, if you remember him.
Bate Turner, a really good receiver that the Jets had.
Or Jim Turner, the Yankee pitching coach.
Another Turner.
Jim Turner.
Hey, number 33 was Jim Turner.
31. He was 31.
Oh,
Bill Dickey was 33, yeah.
Okay. Does that tell you how our memories still work or don't work after all these years? But our passion seems to go on. In closing, I'm going to go around the horn. Anything that you want to say about those times, guys, that would be cathartic for you? I'll start with you, David Hubler.
Yeah, well, I again, like Hal, I'm primarily a baseball guy, and football was something that sort of was, took the place. Didn't take the place of baseball, but it was something to watch. I could just as easily go to a Knicks game as I could go to a Giants game. It didn't make much difference until I found the Rangers. Then the Rangers became like number 2 after the Yankees. But what I really enjoyed watching earlier on was when you went two ways. You went both ways. I mean, it made, for me at least, a more exciting game because rather than have the platoon system, these guys had to play pretty much the whole game. And when they weren't running the ball, they were trying to tackle the opposing team's runners. So I really enjoyed that part of the game. And I remember too when the AFL expanded, or grew actually, and they had the New York team in there, and no one went to those games. I mean, my father works for Bear Stearns, the big house on Wall Street, and they gave away tickets left and right, and no one wanted to use them.
Right, the Titans.
Yeah, the Titans. Yes, the Titans.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Marty Rose and I used to go out there and freeze, and 200 of our closest friends would surround us in the big-ass polo grounds. You know, it was kind of funny, but it was football, the Al days, and Don Maynard. It was terrific.
But the polo grounds, the polo grounds was better designed for football than Yankee Stadium was, because it was horseshoe-shaped, the polo grounds, so that you could actually see the whole field.
It was shaped more like a football field.
Yeah, it was.
Right?
Like a horseshoe, you know,
right,
straight out to the outfield. Mm-hmm.
You were lucky, George. You got to see Philadelphia sports and New York sports. Did you really have a preference between any of the teams?
I didn't really have a Ralph. I didn't really have a preference where we were. We were sort of lucky, just like in baseball. I mean, we were able to get coverage of both New York and Philly. So, I mean, we pretty much knew all the players, the great players on both teams, the Giants and the Eagles. But my biggest memory and a favorite memory of mine was 1969 when the Jets, beat the Colts in the Super Bowl that, Namath guaranteed the win. And it just so happened a couple of years later, I've talked about this before, but Randy Beverly, who was one of the cornerbacks for the Jets, intercepted 2 passes that day, and Randy wound up working for me in the athletic footwear business. And so it was a great memory for me to know that Randy was actually on the field and, really accomplished something in that Super Bowl. And they've had some reunions, and Randy used to talk to me about, they get together and have a lot of laughs and good times. And, that was a memorable Super Bowl because that was the first one where the AFC, wound up the winner.
And it surprised an awful lot of people.
Well, it really did. I mean, and Joe Namath was like, he was like somebody was sent from heaven, with Broadway Joe, and guaranteeing the win, and they pull it off, and that really made the Jets and really made the reputation of Namath on a national scale.
Absolutely. Hal Bock, close us out. If we haven't heard from everybody, if you would.
2 things that stick in my mind about those days. First of all, the New York Journal-American was a newspaper here in New York, and the football writer for the New York Journal-American was a guy named Warren Pack. And the early days of the AFL were not necessarily very successful. Certainly not here in New York. The New York franchise was owned by a broadcaster named Harry Wismer, who was a little off the wall, and the team was not doing well, and they weren't selling many tickets. And one day they played, I don't know what team they played, and stands were half empty, and Warren Pack the next day in the Journal-American, he wrote, the crowd was announced as 33,419. Many came disguised as empty seats. So I again thought that was a brilliant line, I mean, that's magic. I wish I could write that way, you know.
Right.
So that's one of my favorite thoughts, one of my favorite memories about the early days of the AFL.
Hal, let me correct you on one thing. You can write that way, and let me correct you on one thing you said. Not only can you, but I will refer you and the audience to my favorite book of yours, which was Banned. And it really put the times in perspective, and you wrote about these guys very, very well. It was what first called my attention to you, and I think our first podcast was on that, and it's led to hundreds of hours. I'm absolutely blessed by having all four of you guys on a regular basis.
Ralph, can I say something at the end? You didn't call on me.
Of course. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll always call on you, Alan, because you'll always remember that I didn't call on you. And not only that, you remember everything else that has ever happened. So, Alan, you have photographic memory. Please talk.
Okay. When I was at the University of Pittsburgh from fall of 1960 to the summer of 1964. And the Steelers would open, and they'd play in Pitt Stadium. They always, because they couldn't get into Forbes Field as long as the Pirates were there, they always played the Giants up at the Pitt Stadium, which had no lights in those days. And because the Giants couldn't get into Yankee Stadium until the Yankees vacated, which of course was almost always after the World Series. And in Forbes Field, when they moved to Forbes Field, they used to open the gates at halftime. The iron gates out in center field, where the baseball stadium was in center field, and we used to be able to get in there, at the half for a lot of games, and we'd be waiting in the outside, and then all of a sudden a place kick would come out over the wall, and these kids would kill each other. I mean, me or my friends try to get a football, we'd be overrun. And I sat through a game in the snow in 1960 between the Steelers and the Eagles, and I was there the Sunday after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Also, one of the things in those days, the player roster, I think, was something like 33. If you were a punter or a place kicker, unless you did both, there was a guy playing with the Eagles and the Redskins named Sam Baker, who was both a punter and a place kicker. And
Don Chandler. Don
Chandler didn't start place kicking until he got to Green Bay. He never did that with the Giants. And but because you had position players, in some case Hall of Famers, that did the punting or the place kicking in those days. Norm Van Brocklin did punting. Larry, who was a Hall of Famer from the Detroit Lions, did punting. Luke Rosa did kicking. Summerall did kicking, but they were always double duty because there's no roster space back then.
Right. Very good point. That takes us out, gentlemen. Thank you not only for the past and contributing to the book, but thank you for another great podcast. We're still going strong and plan you for another 10.5 years. That's my goal.
Okay. Hey, best of luck with your book, Ralph. That's terrific.
I'm doing the best I can. Thank you very, very much. Be well, everybody. Thank you for listening. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tyko. Al Blumkin was here. Hal Bock was here. David Hubler was here. And George Case III. I think I got the five of us would make a great, I don't know, but
a great
basketball team, but that's for another show. Maybe we can get Henry Bibby back, and that would be fun. And I'll talk less, and Bibby can talk more. Be well, everybody. Thank you for listening. Comfortably Zone Radio Network, and we are over and out. Adios and happy trails.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.